Who are the main Hindu religious officials or specialists?
Traditional Hindu vocabulary includes dozens of technical terms to designate virtually every imaginable variety of religious function or specialized qualification. Essential to every Hindu temple is its priestly staff. Larger temples often have many priests, sometimes called pujaris, those who engage in the daily worship called puja on the staff, one of whom generally serves as chief or senior priest. People generally address priests as Shri, the equivalent of reverend. Frequently but not exclusively of the Brahmin caste nowadays, temple priests marry and have families. At temples that have become important pilgrimage centers, specialists called pandas serve as pilgrim guides and keep records of the families who make up the regular membership of the temple. Ritual specialists called purohitas, those who lead, are generally Brahmins of the Smarta denominations who do mostly home ceremonies for Brahmin families. Gurus, who are generally learned Brahmins, still almost exclusively perform the various samskaras, or rites of passage, and tutor upper caste children in the ancient traditions.
Were early Christians persecuted by Rome? How long did that go on?
As Christianity became more clearly separated from its Jewish roots, Roman authorities all over the Mediterranean became more wary of Christianity's potential threat to Rome's authority. Many Christians refused to burn incense to the emperor and paid with their lives. But executions remained largely a matter of local jurisdiction until about the middle of the 3rd century. Several Roman emperors, such as Nero and Marcus Aurelius, were known for their personal antipathy to Christians. But it was Decius who in 250 CE issued the first general order requiring all in the realm to worship the gods of Rome. Thousands of Christians were executed and many more renounced the faith, at least publicly. Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, began his reign with greater tolerance, but toward the end sanctioned the razing of churches, the burning of scriptures, and wholesale executions. The reign of terror continued until 311 CE, when Emperor Galerius proclaimed a renewal of official toleration of Christians.
What means do Muslim communities use to engage society at large?
In addition to the various forms of charitable giving, an important traditional device within Islamic law has had an enormous impact on life in many Islamic communities throughout history. A waqf is a special religious endowment by which a donor can stipulate that his or her funds be used for a particular project in perpetuity, or as long as the funds last. All over the Middle East and Southern Asia. For example, scores of these dedicated trust funds established centuries ago remain in force, administered by members of particular families or by government officials entrusted with a specific mandate for the oversight of the endowments. Many endowments historically have been funded by royalty, but a significant number are supported by the generosity of other wealthy individuals or even collectives of many devout individuals. Trusts remain an important matter today, and many Muslims are devising other ways in which concerned fellow believers can contribute to endowments supporting important communal projects.
What are the origins and practices of Zionism?
Near the end of the 19th century, many Jews in Eastern Europe began to view Israel as more than just a place for pilgrimages or for occasional settlement by strong believers. Encouraged by the rise of nationalism in Europe, certain Jews sought to return to the land of their ancestors and to make their homes there. This impulse gave rise to the political movement known as Zionism. The expression comes from the word Zion, which is a poetic term for the Holy Land. Zionists see Jews as more than a loosely bound group of religious believers. Politically, Zionists argue that Jews are bound to the land to Israel and that they were chosen for a role that is inextricably connected with Abraham. During the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism, this view became more urgent and provoked heated debate about the nature of Judaism.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT believe in angels?
Spirits of all kinds inhabit the ordinary world of countless adherents of Daoism and CCT. But none quite fit the precise description most readers would identify as angelic. Angels are generally understood as pure immortal spirits made that way from the start. Chinese deist and popular beliefs include countless immortal beings, but apart from the highest gods, most of those began as human beings and achieved immortality later. In addition, angels in other traditions typically function as messengers or guardians. A variety of spirits play those roles in deist and CCT lore. Perhaps the closest thing to angels in the Chinese repertoire of religious symbolism are the apsaras, imported into China with Buddhism.
Who are the black Muslims in the Nation of Islam?
In 1930s Detroit, W. D. Fard began teaching that the ancestors of black Americans had been Muslims. Young Elijah Poole became a devoted follower, and Fard declared Poole his successor and prophet. Elijah took the last name Muhammad and continued to develop a community called the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims. Two prominent young followers of Elijah Muhammad were Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. Malcolm X tells in his autobiography how he discovered during his pilgrimage to Mecca that Elijah Muhammad's teachings of a kind of reverse racism were a lie. All human beings were brothers and sisters under God. And Malcolm returned to try to counter-teach Muhammad's misinterpretations of Islam. Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, but 10 years later, when Muhammad died, Elijah's son Wallace took over and continued to pursue the reform movement Malcolm X had begun. Wallace sought to bring the Nation of Islam, newly named the World Community of Islam in the West, in line with mainstream Muslim teachings. Louis Farrakhan, on the other hand, chose to continue the separatist doctrines of Elijah Muhammad and, with his approximately 50,000 followers, retain the name Nation of Islam.
Who are the principal deities in CIT?
CIT's formal recognition of members of its pantheon went through many changes over the course of more than 3,000 years. Here are some of the principal features of this vast and rather fluid phenomenon. Deities and heavenly powers generally fit into a three-level system. At the top were the powers deemed most necessary to cosmic survival. Ancient tradition includes belief in a mysterious celestial power called Shang. Eventually the word Di came to be the standard term now translated as emperor. But Shang Di was still the supreme emperor. Standard Chinese religious usage also referred to Tian, heaven, as a generic term for the region in which Shang Di lived. Neither Shang Di nor Tian was a personal deity actively involved in human affairs. They were rather the generic source of all things manifest in the universe. But there was yet another power behind Shang Di and Tian. That was the Dao, whose eternal energies of Yang and Yin are manifest in the universe and made known to humanity as the will of heaven. Also on the top level were the royal ancestors, the spirits of earth and grain. And the earth, sometimes referred to as Empress to heaven's emperor. A notch lower came the principal heavenly bodies, Sun and Moon, and Jupiter, whose revolutions of the Sun determine the ritual calendar. Rulers of earlier dynasties, patrons of farming and silk cultivation. And the spirits of heaven and earth round out the second level. Confucius was once a member of the second rank, but was elevated to the first in 1907. At the third level, CIT begins to overlap somewhat with Daoism and CCT, with their more specialized and local deities. Here are gathered the deities of fire, literature, war, artillery, soil, mechanical arts, the hearth, the granary, and the home threshold. Along with the patron deity of Beijing are three dragon deities associated with the city. Finally, several historical heroes fit here as well. A deity called Guandi or Guangong deserves special mention as a crossover figure important in more than one pantheon listing. Guandi is known by a wide variety of names, depending on the constituency of worshippers. Many people identify him as the god of war, though the red-faced, full-bearded deity is chiefly a paragon of civic virtue. The emperor had the authority to rearrange, shrink, or expand the pantheon. He could simply decree a spirit worthy of a particular rank and eventually even declare worship of that being the practice of the realm by instituting temples in his or her honor.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Christians?
Attitudes toward intermarriage vary from one church to another. It is safe to say that on the whole, Christian parents tend to prefer that their children marry other Christians, and that Christian pastors tend to offer similar advice. There are two large issues at stake here. One is that when both spouses worship together, they may have a better chance at a durable marriage. The other has to do with raising children.
What is the purpose of religious rituals?
Religious rituals function primarily to help believers establish relationships of presence, imagination, or memory with the spiritual. There is naturally some overlap among these three goals of ritual. Some rituals affect or mediate a connection between participants and a divine or spiritual presence.
What is original sin?
According to mainstream Christian tradition, the story Adam and Eve is critical to an understanding of the relationship between human beings and their Creator. According to Genesis 2:16-17 and 3:1-24, God commanded these first human beings not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A tempter tried to persuade them that God was merely defending his own turf in order to prevent Adam and Eve from becoming like himself. Once the primordial couple succumbed to the lure of such dangerous knowledge, they became aware of their potential for disobedience and lost their pristine innocence. Christian theologians have interpreted this critical moment in human history, known as the Fall, in various ways. From the time of the early Church Fathers on through the Middle Ages, theologians have discussed how the descendants of Adam and Eve inherited both their guilt and their inherent moral weakness. Protestant reformers stimulated further debate in the context of their discussion of faith and works.
Have there ever been any reform movements within Hinduism?
Since the early 19th century, various important reform movements have addressed the need to reinterpret ancient tradition for modern times. The Brahmo Samaj, Society of God, denounced the practice of widow suicide, sati, and promoted a monotheistic understanding of Hindu faith. Its successor organization, the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, Universal Society of God, took aim at the caste system and looked for ways to update the tradition without having to resort to European ways of thinking. Some reformers, such as Ramankrishna, 1836–86, and his disciple Vivekananda, 1863–1902, offered fresh interpretations of both Bhakti and Vedanta that they hoped would appeal to the world beyond India. 20th century successors to those pioneering reformers included Sri Aurobindo, 1872–1950, and Mahatma Gandhi, 1869–1948. Both studied in England and returned with distinctive views on how modern Hindus might revitalize their traditions. Sri Aurobindo proposed a form of modernist interpretation incorporating elements of European philosophy, and Gandhi emphasized simplicity of life and taught nonviolent means of political protest. Both men founded ashrams, quiet places in which spiritual seekers could find spiritual refuge.
Do Christians mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Christian places of worship, generally called churches, almost always have one immediately identifiable feature, namely, a cross. Eastern churches often display a cross with distinctive short, sometimes slanted, bars above and below the main horizontal crossbar. Many also have one or more spires that have traditionally held the church's bells. Although the bells of most churches rarely mark all the hours of the day as they once did, some communities still mark the beginning of services by tolling them. Church designs today are remarkably varied. Some employ medieval or classical models, some favor the simplicity of early American colonial models, and some represent the latest in avant-garde architecture. One symbolic feature of many traditional and contemporary designs alike is the arrangement of the interior space in the form of a cross. A metaphorical shape that has been fairly popular in modern churches is that of a ship, recalling ancient images of the church as Peter's bark. A feature of many churches is an antechamber or vestibule that marks a transition between outer and inner worlds. A brief passage that might allow worshippers to shift mental and spiritual gears. Interior features vary from one denomination to another. Catholic and Episcopalian churches, among others, typically have an altar table near the back wall. Almost all have one or more podiums, possibly well elevated. One of them will be called the pulpit, from which the preacher delivers the sermon or homily. Christian churches generally arrange their spaces for open visual communication between the sanctuary and the body or congregational area. Orthodox, such as Russian, Greek, Armenian, and Serbian, and some other Eastern churches often lack the benches or pews found in most other churches. They also typically have a high screen, called the iconostasis, that hides the congregation's view of actions that take place at the altar behind it, emphasizing the mysterious nature of the ritual.
What would Confucius have considered a cause for gratitude to heaven?
First and foremost, propriety in all of the important human relationships. In addition, he would have been grateful for the predictable workings of nature. As essential as they both are to life, neither is a sure thing. When relationships and the cosmos are as they ought to be, these are the great wonders. As for Confucius himself, though he healed no one and raised no one from the dead, he did something equally marvelous: he taught without discrimination.
How do Shinto practitioners deal ritually with death and mourning?
According to a saying, Shinto marries, Buddhism buries. During the Tokugawa era, 1600 to 1868, an imperial decree stipulated that only Buddhist priests should conduct funeral rites. Most cemeteries in Japan are connected to Buddhist temples rather than Shinto shrines. But there are exceptions to that general rule. And practitioners of Shinto have important beliefs and rituals concerning death and mourning. A major difference between Buddhist and Shinto practices is that Shinto rites never occur in shrines. 4 shrines are strictly dedicated to the kami. Shinto tradition regards death as a form of evil and a serious source of pollution. Shinto belief and practice has been profoundly influenced by certain Confucian attitudes toward departed ancestors. And large numbers of Japanese still perform rites of ancestor veneration. Some Japanese families still follow the practice of enshrining a deceased person's symbols in a spirit house. Tamaya, placed beneath the home's kamidana, 7 weeks after a funeral. Some of Japan's largest shrines are dedicated to memorializing the spirits of great human beings elevated to the status of kami. Grief, kibyaku, is associated with a prescribed period during which the experience of death renders family members impure. The bereaved family should stay away from shrines and refrain from Shinto ritual generally during that interval. In pre-Buddhist times, the Japanese sometimes constructed monumental memorials to the dead. Historically, lay people performed Shinto funeral rituals, with main participants wearing white. Today, Shinto rites, led by priests, occur in homes or funeral establishments. Some shrines continue to perform memorial rites for those who have died in battle.
What are angels? Do they have a role in many traditions?
Angels and similar celestial beings appear in numerous traditions all over the world. The classic image of the angel, a winged ethereal body with human features, may have originated in the Middle East. The ancient prophetic tradition called Zoroastrianism had a highly developed cosmology. in which angel-like beings called Amishaspentas were attendants at the heavenly court of Ahura Mazda. Even in the early books of the Hebrew Bible we find mention of heavenly emissaries who deliver divine messages to people. The name angel comes from the Greek word for messenger and became associated with the mysterious figures because of what appears to be their principal function. But angels play many other roles as well, including that of warrior, guardian, and protector. Heavenly counselor, winged mount, celestial guide, or escort, to name but a few. Angels play prominent roles in Christian and Islamic, as well as biblical Jewish, lore and spirituality. On the whole, they act as intermediaries between the realms of the divine and the human. Ancient Indian, especially Buddhist, tradition includes luminous beings called apsaras. Though not depicted as winged, these lovely beings usually float through the air in scenes decorating Buddhist temples all over Asia. They often function as dancers and musicians.
Are there mythic elements in Hindu tradition?
Hinduism's sacred texts comprise one of the world's greatest treasure troves of myth. Non-Hindus, especially Westerners who find themselves inclined to discount Hindu tradition as just a collection of stories, are shutting the door to that watershed of insight called the imagination. All religious traditions build on a master story composed of accounts about how the world came to be, what human beings are all about, and the relationship between humankind and the greater being or power responsible for the shape of things. Some traditions, such as the Abrahamic faiths, wrap themselves around narratives they call their sacred history. Other traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, consider human history much too small a stage for any drama under the direction of the ultimate reality. History begins, stretches out, and comes to a definitive end. But the view that history is all about what actually happened while myth is purely imaginary is seriously flawed. History and myth are two very different ways to answer the big questions about human life. Sacred history tells how God has worked in the world by identifying certain events as the result of divine intervention. Mythic narrative tells the story of the otherness of ultimate reality by stretching the limits of the imagination. History works from the ground up, so to speak, and turns around the power of memory, while myth starts with mystery and cultivates the human capacity for wonder. What non-Hindus may be tempted to criticize as a weakness in Hindu tradition, Hindus regard as their tradition's great strength. Both approaches yield important forms of narrative theology. Far from being simply contradictory, myth and history complement each other.
How does one assess the quality of virtue?
The ethical barometer is a faculty called kokoro, a term that suggests a union of mind and heart. What some traditions call purity of heart, Shinto tradition calls brightness, sime. Purified of all ill intent, the mind and heart are illumined through intimacy with the divine. Individuals do not evaluate their actions in terms of whether they will reap reward or suffer punishment as a consequence. Rather, they think of how their actions might affect the life of the community here and now.
What is the relationship between Daoism and martial arts?
Early each morning, nearly everywhere in China, people gather in public places both large and small to practice a slow graceful routine of physical movements called Tai Chi Chuan. People of all ages can engage in this activity. Though it is not strenuous the way higher speed exercises can be, Tai Chi, also commonly spelled Tai Chi, nevertheless puts noticeable demands on an astonishingly wide range of muscles all over the body. The idea is not simple physical toning, however, even though that is an obvious benefit. Its purpose is to maintain or restore one's overall sense of health and well-being through relaxed concentration. Proper practice relieves blockages of vital energy and returns the whole person to balance and harmony both physically and spiritually. Tai Chi routines and styles are varied, with 3 methods called Chen, Wu, and Yang most common nowadays. Many of the underlying principles in the practice are of Daoist origin and remain a regular part of the regimen in many Daoist monasteries. But it seems more reasonable on the whole to identify Tai Chi as a more generically Chinese phenomenon, since for centuries non-Daoists have made use of it with no apparent direct connection with Daoist beliefs. As for its relationship to actual martial arts, Tai Chi movement is based on the notion that non-aggressiveness, what is called being weak like water, is ultimately more effective than trying to overwhelm one's opponent with brute force. Hence, for example, the Japanese term judo derives from a Chinese term, rodeo, that means the way of yielding.
Who are the Vaishnavites?
About half the world's Hindus belong to the various sub-denominations of Vaishnavism. In general, northern Vaishnavas understand Vishnu as a form of Krishna, while most southerners think of either Rama or Krishna as forms of Vishnu. 5 major Vaishnava schools trace their origins to famous founders who lived between about 1000 and 1500 CE. Different ways of describing the divine-human relationship mark the principal distinctions among the 5 denominations and the various sectarian divisions that have arisen from them. Ramanuj, 1017 to 1137, was a major figure in a predominantly southern school called Sri Vaishnavism. So called because of the centrality of Vishnu's consort Sri. Ramanuj taught a modified form of non-dualism. called Vishishtadvaita, according to which individual souls are aspects of the divine, part of God, but retain their individuality and do not lose their identity in their union with the divine. Madhva, 1197-1278, disagreed, insisting on a fuller distinction between the human and the divine. His teaching is a type of pure theism in which God freely chooses to reach with love and grace across an infinite and otherwise unbridgeable chasm. Madhva's dualist, Dvaita, branch is also primarily a southern tradition, while the remaining three are more popular in the north. Nimbarka, 1125-1162, focused on the role of the Guru as the central means of grace in his Mainandi school. Vallabha, 1475-1530, taught a form of pure non-dualism, also called panentheism, God in all things. His commentaries on the Bhagavata Purana detail his mystical interpretation of the so-called love games of Krishna, in which the Lord's romance with the gopis becomes a model of the human quest for the divine beloved and vice versa. Chaitanya, 1485-1534, preached devotion to Krishna and Radha through communal dance and song. Of the several contemporary subsects of his Gaudiya Vaishnava group, perhaps the best known is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
What do Christians commemorate on Holy, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday?
The Easter Triduum, 3-day period, begins with the commemoration of the evening on which Jesus gathered his apostles for the Last Supper. Maundy, from the Latin word mandatum, the new commandment of service Jesus gave his disciples then. Or Holy Thursday is marked in several churches by special rituals, some of which include a symbolic washing of the feet of several attendees by the priest or bishop. Good Friday recalls the crucifixion and death of Jesus.
What is an Ayatollah?
Ayatollah is Arabic for sign of God, an honorific title conferred on leading Shiite religious scholars, especially in Iran and Iraq. In traditional Shiite circles, accomplished scholars can attain the rank of Ayatollah by popular acclaim and through the acknowledgement of their peers. Among those of that rank, some are also further distinguished by the title Grand Ayatollah. Of those, in turn, a group of 7 have traditionally been singled out as sources of imitation and are thereby acknowledged as the most influential teachers among Shiite Muslims.
What are the main Christian notions of afterlife?
Christian eschatology focuses on distinctive understandings of death, judgment, and consequential experiences called purgatory, heaven, and hell. First of all, death is not the end of life, but the beginning of a different mode of existence. Death is the doorway to a world beyond this. But since each person is responsible for his or her choices in life, there will be an accounting called judgment. Immediately after death comes the particular judgment, of significance especially in Catholic theology. At that moment the individual becomes aware with utter clarity where he or she stands with God. Depending on the situation, the state of the individual soul then changes to an experience of either damnation, purification, or bliss. Individuals who have consistently chosen separation from God, a state called mortal sin, will then be granted their wish permanently, in hell. Those whose lifelong choices have been tainted with self-will and ill intent, called venial sin, may need to experience a long but limited period of purification called purgatory. Once cleansed of the last vestiges of self-absorption, these individuals will experience a change and be ready to enjoy the eternal presence of God. Those whom the particular judgment reveals to be in a state of grace are believed to move directly to the experience of the beatific vision, or heaven, a state of eternal delight enveloped in divine love. All Christian theologies speak of a general judgment, which will occur at the end of time at the resurrection of the dead. Then God will call all humanity to account and seal its fate for eternity. Protestant reformers rejected both the notion of particular judgment and the intermediate state of purgatory, teaching that only two possibilities, heaven or hell, awaited at the general judgment. A further state known as limbo is reserved in some traditions for the unbaptized. Limbo is a rather neutral condition, lacking either suffering or supernal bliss. For all the righteous who lived before Christ, as well as for all infants who die without baptism.
What is a rite of passage?
In the life of every individual, certain times naturally stand out as particularly significant. Birth, the transition from childhood to adulthood, or puberty. The assumption of a new state in life, as in a marriage, and death are especially critical times. Religious traditions generally acknowledge these and other formative experiences by developing rituals designed to help people cope with the changes they bring. Sheer difficulty and challenge can sometimes be the distinguishing features of important moments or phases of a life. Confusion, sense of loss and grief, even overwhelming joy or feelings of limitless possibility can be cause for recourse to the comfort and direction rites of passage can afford. Rituals of this kind help believers by allowing them to step out of ordinary time and space for a while to regain their bearings. They can then return to real life feeling renewed, spiritually refreshed, and strengthened for the challenges ahead.
What is the mandate of heaven?
Confucians have interpreted the concept of mandate or will of heaven in various ways over the centuries. As an ingredient in Confucian political thought, the concept has functioned both as a means of legitimation of the regime in power and a justification for overthrowing an unjust regime. The notion derives from a traditional Chinese belief in an elaborate network of correspondences among all levels of existence: the heavenly, the earthly, and the human. Human beings are not the independent source of authority. They can hope for harmony only through sensitivity to the ways of heaven above and of nature below. Order in society depends on the good faith effort of a single human being. The emperor as son of heaven, to rule unselfishly by always consulting the will of heaven. A theory of imminent retribution holds that there is a direct connection between natural and moral evil. In the world and heaven's displeasure with any emperor who arrogantly forgets the source of his authority. When the people prosper, one can conclude with certainty that affairs of state are in order. All as a direct result of the emperor's keeping his priorities straight. Many of the great Confucian thinkers have taught that the tradition's most consistent contribution to society has been that of fearlessly holding the ruler responsible to his people. If the one on the throne presides over an unjust regime, that person is no longer worthy of the name emperor. According to Meng Ziyi, for example, the people have the right to remove such a fraudulent leader. Meng Ziyi argued that violent overthrow of an unjust ruler was not regicide but tyrannicide. The greatest sovereign, therefore, is the one who governs only after first submitting to a higher authority.
Where do Hindus live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
India is home to the vast majority, about 95%, of the world's nearly 1 billion Hindus. Other significant minority populations have Hindu communities in more than half a dozen other lands. Almost 24 million Hindus are Nepalese. Over 12 million live in Bangladesh, nearly 6 million in Indonesia, some 2 million in the United States, and approaching 1.5 million each in Malaysia, Pakistan, South Africa, and England. Virtually every nation on earth now has representatives of Hinduism among its citizenry. Hindus are about 200 million fewer than Muslims, half the total global population of Christians, and somewhere between 2 and 3 times that of Buddhism.
Do Muslims use ritual sacrifice?
Muslims mark the high point of the annual season of Hajj, which runs from the 8th to the 13th day of the 9th lunar month, with the Feast of the Sacrifice. Also called the Great Feast, the rituals on the 10th of the month include the slaughtering of an animal in memory of God, providing a ram for Abraham to sacrifice in lieu of his son Ishmael. Sheep, goats, oxen, or cows, and camels are traditional sacrificial animals. The person performing the sacrifice dedicates the animals to God and mentions the names of those partaking of the fruits of the sacrifice. Muslims all over the world observe the Feast of Sacrifice with special activities. Food ritually sacrificed is usually prepared in large quantities, so that as those present for the festivities share in the feast, so the abundance can be distributed to those in need. Animals ritually slaughtered during Hajj season are not sold for profit. In some parts of the world, Muslims still sacrifice a sheep in connection with an optional birth ritual. When a child is 7 days old, some families shave the baby's head, a practice dating to Muhammad's time.
How do Hindus use statues and other similar visual imagery in worship?
Sacred sculpture plays a central role in the overall symbolism of Hindu devotional ritual. Individual images, called vigraha, something one can grasp, of each of the major deities are generally of granite or marble, though some are made of other materials. Sculptors follow principles laid down in medieval texts that stipulate in detail the proportions and features essential for each deity. Some regard dark stone as the ideal medium because it suggests infinite power and mystery. Images are not themselves deities, but merely specific places in which the deity condescends to dwell for the benefit of devotees. When devotees lavish ritual attention on the images, they acknowledge the sacred symbolized there, rather than any power inherent in the material image. Each major temple image resides in a cave-like shrine called the womb chamber, Garbhagriha, that offers an essential clue to the metaphorical purpose of sacred sculpture. Images represent the dark mystery of divine fecundity from which all things emerge. Central to image-based ritual is the notion of darshan, seeing and being seen by the deity. In a manner analogous to Eastern Christian use of icons, Hindu practice interprets the eyes as the central visual symbol in the relationship between the devotee and the ultimate object of devotion. God sees the individual as surely as the devotee sees God. It is neither magic nor simple idolatry, but an acknowledgement of the fundamental human need to pray with all the senses. Images offer devotees something to hold on to, a way of understanding.
What does the rebirth of a non-self mean?
Buddhist tradition has devised various intricate ways of explaining this problem. One widely used image is that of a seal ring. Take a pad of warm wax and press the seal ring into it and you get a very clear impression. One that firms up as the wax cools. You've transferred something without actually leaving anything but an impression. The seal ring is something like what remains when a human being dies still enslaved to inappropriate craving and desires. It represents the whole complex of psychic energies that make up a human personality. Energies so potent that most people are perfectly convinced of their individuality and separate personhood. In the cycle of death and rebirth, what transfers from one existence across the chasm of death into the wax of a new embodiment is precisely that incredibly powerful ego impulse. As the Buddha saw it, no one can be finally free so long as he or she clings to the notions of I, me, mine.
Doesn't that suggests that Shinto is less than authentically religious? If it were, some argue, it hardly would tolerate multiple religious allegiances, would it?
Some point to Shinto's concern with the ordinary, the everyday. The natural world that surrounds us, and its lack of interest in transcendent mystery.
How do Confucians deal ritually with death and mourning?
Confucian practices associated with funerals and ancestor veneration are of a piece with those of Daoism and CCT. In that the basic elements are common to most segments of traditional Chinese societies. Confucius and his disciples did have some specific thoughts on the matter, though. Disciple Sun Zi wrote that the feelings of loss and longing for a deceased person, and the ritual expression of those feelings, represented the height of human civilization and culture. In a way, one knows the humanity of others through the attachment they express for lost loved ones. Although Confucius himself declined to speculate about the experience of death or the condition of one who has died, he seems to have felt strongly that there were appropriate ritual and emotional responses. When asked whether he recommended the full 3-year period of mourning, Confucius responded that if literati who lose loved ones were to dispense with the practice, they would risk the irrevocable loss of some of society's most important rituals. He added that if the questioner felt comfortable performing only a year's grieving, he might do so. After the questioner had left, however, the teacher commented how heartless such a person must be. Parents attend to their infants unceasingly for 3 years. The least their children can do is return the favor symbolically. One specific issue that has historically been very important for Confucianism and CIT is the question of monumental funereal architecture and special memorials for the great and powerful. Confucius and several of the tradition's later teachers have been remembered with fairly modest grave markers. Tombs of emperors, on the other hand, have often been grand, even extravagant, architectural works. At least one ruler even commissioned a virtual reconstruction of the royal residence underground, complete with thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers to protect the imperial remains.
Who is the Antichrist?
Antichrist is the generic title given to an individual, organization, or principle of evil believed to represent all that runs counter to the values of Jesus Christ. Only the two letters of John use the term, referring to people who refuse to believe in the Incarnation. Some early Christians labeled Roman emperors antichrists because of their opposition to the faith. Some Protestant groups occasionally have dubbed the Pope the Antichrist. Similarly, some Muslims today characterize any external enemy as the Great Satan. Christians throughout history have identified as the Antichrist the various evil forces of which the Book of Revelation speaks, including Rome and the beasts whose appearance will signal the apocalypse. Perhaps the most common and persistent view is that at the end of time, Jesus, in his second coming, will confront and vanquish an impostor who claims to be Christ, i.e., the Antichrist, but not before the impostor has managed to lure many believers from the faith.
What is Confucianism and who were the literati?
Confucianism refers to the system of social, ethical, and religious beliefs and practices associated with Confucius. The term does not imply the worship of Confucius as a supreme or central deity, but it does acknowledge his foundational and pivotal role in the cultivation of beliefs and practices that have remained important in many Asian societies for centuries. Some scholars suggest that we replace Confucianism with literati tradition, to indicate that the complex of beliefs and practices now generally attributed to Confucius is actually part of a broader cultural phenomenon. Literati, the Latin for the lettered, educated, is a name coined by non-Chinese scholars to describe the cultural elite most influential in promoting and preserving the Chinese imperial system. The literati were the highly educated, professionally specialized bureaucrats who maintained the far-flung governmental structures of the empire. They also functioned as the ritual specialists in the many religious ceremonies performed under imperial auspices for sponsorship.
Is meditation important for Buddhists?
Buddhist tradition has refined a number of meditative practices. Two important aspects taught by an ancient Theravada authority named Buddhaghosa, c. 400, are called dwelling in tranquility, shamatha, and insight, vipassana. In order to catch the fish of intuitive knowledge, one has first to get to the calm, clear lake. Attaining a measure of tranquility is a process of disciplined concentration in which the meditator gradually withdraws from sensory input through 19 successive stages of attentiveness and reflection. Insight meditation involves the discipline of observing sensory input with perfect mindfulness in order to arrive at genuine wisdom. Traditional explanations typically recommend shamatha before vipassana, but they go together and the process may actually be circular tranquility leading to insight leading to deeper tranquility. Buddhaghosa suggests 40 objects for contemplation to eliminate distraction and lead to contemplative states. Each person is characterized by tendencies to one of the three qualities of lust, hatred, and delusion, and must focus on counteracting that major cause of distraction. To transform lust into faith. First meditate on physical impermanence and then on the virtues of the Buddha. Transform hatred into understanding by meditating first on love, compassion, and joy, and proceed to an awareness of mortality and physical dissolution. Turn delusion to deliberation by focusing on breathing as a means to calming. As for the achievement of insight, Buddhaghosa recommends the 7 purities. Here the meditator focuses on the purity of virtue, of mind, of belief, of overcoming doubt, of the knowledge of right and wrong action, of insight into spiritual progress, and of knowledge and insight themselves. Mahayana tradition adapted Buddhaghosa's classical methods to its teaching about the Bodhisattva's saving role. Each dedicated seeker progresses spiritually by meditating on the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva career. This is the steepest of paths, beginning with the accumulation of merit and knowledge and proceeding through multiple levels of meditative discipline.
Is there such a thing as a Hindu saint?
Certain features of the sadhu and sannyasi are quite consistent with concepts of sainthood in various religious traditions. But individuals called sants add still another dimension to the Hindu tradition's complex understanding of the human embodiment of holiness. Sadhus and sannyas may seem at first to be socially liminal characters, but they are actually very much a part of the classical socio-religious system. The term sant is a vernacular version of the Sanskrit sat, meaning real, authentic. Ironically perhaps, the sants are genuine because they stand apart from the system and have taken up the cause of the truly marginalized, the outcasts and untouchables. Associated with Bhakti movements both Shaivite and Vaishnavite, saints have often spread their message as troubadours, gathering crowds by singing at important holy places. One of the most influential of them was Kabir, c. 1440 to 1518, whose songs were a major influence in Guru Nanak's 1469 to 1538 founding of the Sikh movement. Other important Hindu sants were Jaineshwara, 1275 to 96, Ekanatha, 1533 to 98, and Tukaram, 1608 to 49.
What is a ritual object or implement?
Ritual objects include a large number of items both symbolic and practical that are the essential devices of religious practice. They may be as outwardly pedestrian as containers for the raw materials of religious offering: rice, salt, wine, bread, or the utensils needed to move those materials around. These tools often have no major symbolic meaning but are largely utilitarian. Though they are generally regarded as sacred because of the context and are not to be used for non-ritual purposes. Many other ritual objects are more symbolic than practical in function. Every tradition has its symbols for the ultimate spiritual reality. For the various kinds of benefits and blessings believers seek from that reality, and for the gifts devotees bring as offerings. Among the most common are images or icons, books or scrolls of sacred text, lamps, musical instruments, weapons, and special vestments or garb for officiants and sometimes participants.
When do Muslims make pilgrimage to Mecca and what do they do there?
Formal season for the greater pilgrimage, called the Hajj, occurs between the 8th and 13th day of the 12th lunar month. The journey is required of all Muslims with sufficient health and financial resources. Assuming also that making the Hajj would not require them to shirk serious family responsibilities at home. As pilgrims enter a forbidden zone that encircles Mecca, called the Haram, they put on the plain white wraps called the ihram, pronounced ihram. The garb marks a transition to sacred space and time, and reminds pilgrims of their simple equality before God. Though precise ritual activities depend on both variations within the four Sunni law schools as well as on whether or not pilgrims intend to combine Hajj with Umrah. Lesser pilgrimage, the following offers an idea of the major elements. On the first day, the 8th of the month, they usually circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times. Pray at the station of Abraham, pray 2 cycles of prostrations, and drink from the spring of Zamzam. Heading for Mina outside of Mecca. Most pilgrims will stay overnight there before moving on to the plain of Arafat. They stand before the Mount of Mercy, recalling the deeds of Muhammad and Abraham here long ago. That evening they go a short distance back toward Mecca, to Muzdalifah, where on the 3rd day they celebrate the Feast of Sacrifice, Eid al-Adha. Moving back to Mina later that day, pilgrims cast 7 stones at one of 3 pillars. A symbolic repudiation of the temptations of Satan. After a symbolic clipping or shaving of hair, pilgrims remove the ihram and return to Mecca to circumambulate the Kaaba and run 7 times between the hills Safa and Marwa to commemorate Hagar's frantic search for water. During the 11th through 13th days, pilgrims remain at Mina, casting the remainder of 49 stones collected earlier at all 3 of the pillars. Those who did not participate in the sacrifice on the 10th day may do so now. To end the whole event, most will again circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times. In recent years the Saudi government has expanded their pilgrimage facilities dramatically in order to accommodate annual crowds now numbering 2 million or more.
But what about conversion from one Christian group to another?
In those cases, practice concerning baptism varies. Some churches re-administer the ritual in the belief that the convert's former community was not authentically Christian. Others consider all Christian baptism valid and binding, since it is unnecessary to repeat the ceremony. They might substitute for it another religious ritual of welcome into the new community of believers.
What rites do Christians practice in church?
Primary Christian communal rituals are as nearly varied as the communities that perform them. A broad distinction between liturgical and non-liturgical churches is useful here. Liturgical churches feature a carefully regulated set of rituals, often of great antiquity. Only a handful of specialists, typically garbed in traditional vestments and sometimes using ancient liturgical languages for all or part of the ritual, may participate. In liturgical churches, the spectator model emphasizes the performance of a sacred action with relatively limited participation by the congregation. In the middle of the spectrum, some churches follow what is called an order of service, with the emphasis on preaching rather than on the sacred action of liturgical ritual as such. Leaders here often wear an academic-style robe and lead from a pulpit within a separate space called the sanctuary. Activities in entirely non-liturgical churches often tend to be more like a town meeting. Worship leaders sometimes a robe, but more often ordinary semi-formal street clothes. Services emphasize more inclusive participation during virtually all phases of the gathering, but preaching by the leader and sometimes by one or more others as well, remains a centerpiece.
Have there been important Jewish mystics?
Esoteric interpretation of certain texts of the Hebrew Bible has formed the basis of developments in Jewish mysticism. Visionary accounts in which the prophet Ezekiel, for example, describes seeing four wheels in the sky led to what is called Merkava, chariot or throne, mysticism. The Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Creation, an ancient cosmological treatise, eventually exercised great influence on mystical thinking. Traditional accounts trace the origins of mystical interpretation to 12th century Europe. There the originally Italian Colonimus family, transplanted to the Rhine Valley in Germany, became the nucleus of important developments. Samuel the Pious and son Judah began an important movement of Hasidic spirituality at Speyer, as did Eliezer ben Judah, d. 1228, at Worms. They were contemporary with similar developments among Christian Rhenish mystics, and devised a style of spiritual canticle called the Din Shamayim, Law of the Heavens, with a type of prayer, called Jacob's Ladder, that symbolized spiritual ascent. Further important developments occurred with a later generation of Iberian Jews. Abraham ben Samuel Abulafia, 1240–1292, of Saragossa wrote prolifically of the need to achieve spiritual freedom, liberating the soul through a combined discipline of contemplation, reflection on mystical meanings of Hebrew letters, and the cultivation of what was in effect a kind of Jewish yoga. According to tradition, Abulafia's contemporary Moses ben Shem Tov of Leon, 1240–1305, composed perhaps the single most influential mystical text, the Zohar, Book of Splendor. Based on a theory of emanation, the Zohar teaches that the divine presence becomes manifest in the material world through a series of 10 sephirot or spheres that symbolize the increasingly tangible presence of divine energy, the Shekinah. As a movement, Jewish mysticism generally goes by the name Kabbalah, reception. It was revived in the 16th century in Israel by Solomon Alcabez, 1505–84, and Isaac Luria, 1534–73.
What's the difference between a stupa and a pagoda?
A stupa is an ancient Indian burial or reliquary monument. Its fundamental unit is a solid hemispherical earthen mound called the egg, anda, or womb, garbha. Atop the mound sits a solid square or rectangular shape, originally surrounded by a four-sided railing, called the harmika, that may be a remnant of the days when the village altar stood inside a fenced enclosure. Growing tree-like from that is a pillar that pierces several circular discs of decreasing diameter, usually an odd number from 3 to 11. The result looks like a multi-tiered parasol. The Buddha's cremated remains are said to have been originally enshrined in a large number of stupas built all over India. Mahayana teaching developed the notion that the Buddha was a cosmic spiritual being, rather than a mere human teacher, and the architecture of the stupa evolved to reflect those changes. Stupa designers began to raise the mound off the ground by using several square bases, meanwhile stretching the mound itself upward much the way a potter turns a round lump of clay into a tall graceful vase. The parasol is also stretched heavenward, becoming more streamlined and adding discs. When Mahayana Buddhism moved into China, architects transformed the upper portion of the stupa into an independent structure, turning the multiple discs into roofs. The earth-hugging funerary mound was replaced by the pagoda. The new structure was derived from the stupa and still contained relics, but the pagoda symbolized transcendence rather than earthly existence. Pagodas soon added their own sets of multiple discs, leaving the stupa, so to speak, in the dust, in the Theravada lands of Southeast Asia. Reminders of the stupa remain in the gently tapered monuments of Burma and Thailand. Mahayana Buddhist establishments all over East Asia identify themselves with their graceful, multi-roofed pagodas. Unlike the typical stupa, the pagoda actually has interior space, sometimes on several levels.